We are live.
Okay. Welcome everybody to this session, plenary session of the ISEC conference on development and inequalities. As you know, we have a very distinguished scholar who accepted to act as a keynote speaker for this session, Professor Joe Stiglitz, winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2001. I would like to have our rector, Professor Stocchi, Vilberto Stocchi from the University of Urbino, say some words of introduction. And then, as you all know, we are going to have a presentation by Professor Stiglitz on the theme of COVID, coronavirus, and inequalities. And he is going to have enough time for an in-depth presentation, and followed by a discussion delivered by Professor Pianta from our University of Urbino and University of Florence, and from Professor Anna Maria Simonazzi from the University of Rome. After that, there will be an open discussion. As you know, we are going live streaming, so there will be discussion both from this platform, the Teams platform, for those who have been admitted to this, and from the web, whoever is willing to contribute. We'll tell you some more about this after the presentation is done. So I'll leave the floor to Professor Stocchi for an introduction. Go ahead.
Antonello, thanks. Good afternoon to everyone. It's a great pleasure to open this session and to give the welcome to all the participants. In particular, it is a great honor to have with us Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize for Economics. Professor Stiglitz, I am a biochemist. As rector, during the opening speech in opening the new academic year in 2017, talking to the students, I cited your statement. The results of growth should not be measured only according to the econometric indicators, but according to the project of the quality of life and sustainability, a dimension of the soul rather than an economic and scientific parameter. Today, Stiglitz will talk about COVID-19 and the deepening inequality. This is a very relevant topic that touches all of us. Professor Stiglitz, our university was born in 1506, and Urbino at that time, it has been the capital of Renaissance for almost 30 years. A great time in our history where the person is in a central position. We have to recover these fundamental aspects and to be active subjects in promoting a new humanism. Professor Stiglitz, thank you again for having accepted to be today with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I wish I could have been in Urbino for this occasion. Much more pleasurable than being on Zoom. But we'll have to wait until the pandemic is under control before that happens. And it's a real pleasure to talk to your association on the study of comparative economic systems. This pandemic is a test of alternative economic systems. It's in a sense, a natural experiment. The pandemic has gone all over the world. Some economic, social, political systems have done much better in controlling the pandemic than others. And some economic, political, and social systems have done much better in controlling the economic and social consequences of the pandemic. So in many ways, the pandemic, as I say, it's not a controlled experiment. We don't have controlled experiments with pandemics, but it's a natural experiment where we can look at what countries have done well, what kinds of systems have done well, and what kinds of systems have done poorly. So when we talk about doing well or doing poorly, the point that the rector made in his introduction is absolutely vital. We want to ask, how do we evaluate an economic system? It's not just about GDP. GDP could go up, but most citizens can be worse off. In the United States, GDP has gone up almost every year, except this year. But most of the benefits have gone to the people at the very top. The people in the middle, people in the bottom have seen their income stagnate or even decline. So from that point of view, it's not an economic success. But the pandemic has emphasized another very important aspect of any economic, social, and political system, and that is its resilience. We've been affected by a shock, and some societies have been able to cope with that shock better. They've been able to control the disease better, and they've been able to minimize the economic consequences of the shock. Among the countries that have done very well, for instance, are countries like New Zealand, South Korea, Germany, and among the countries that have done very badly are Brazil, India, and the United States. So the question I want to pose, the main question I want to ask in this talk is, what can we say about what characteristics of an economic, social, political system contribute to success and what contribute to failure? And what are the implications of that insights for current policies and for prospects for the future? I want to begin, though, by spending a few minutes on a book that I published just shortly before the pandemic. It was called People, Power, and Profits. And in that book, I asked a broader question, a broader set of questions. I asked, what explains the wealth of nations? Of course, that was the question that Adam Smith had asked in 1776. The question is, why are some countries wealthier or doing better than others? And why is it that for hundreds of years before the end of the 18th century, incomes had stagnated? No significant increase in per capita incomes over centuries and centuries. And then suddenly, incomes in a few advanced countries started to soar. So that was one question I wanted to ask. The second question I wanted to ask is, how do we explain disparities, income disparities, wealth disparities within countries? And the themes that I raised in that book, I believe, have been in many ways highlighted by the pandemic. So I want to talk for a minute about the themes in my book, People, Power, and Profits. The first is the importance of science. The basis more broadly of the success of the countries of the world in the Industrial Revolution in the last 250 years is basically we learned how to learn about nature. And that enabled the advances in technology, that enabled the advances in the modes of production that have led to the increases in standards of living and life expectancies. You know, life expectancy is one handle, another way of looking at the increase in well-being that goes beyond GDP, and increases in life expectancy have been enormous. So the advances in science are one basis of the Enlightenment agenda that had brought us higher standards of living. A second is social organization. We learned how to organize complex societies. You know, before the 18th century, most production was agriculture, limited need for complex social organization. There were some commerce, but it is nothing like that of a modern society. And as we have more complex organizations, we have to have systems of governance, ideas like the rule of law, in the political sphere, separation of power, checks and balances. And underlying both science and our systems of social organization are important, is the importance of systems of discovering, assessing, verifying the truth. It's obvious at the center of science, but it's also important for the functioning of social organization, for us to be able to cooperate and work together. One of the reasons, quite frankly, that I wrote this book, People, Power, and Profits, was I had been concerned with what was going on in the United States by the Trump administration in undermining our basic institutions of science, social organization, and our institutions related to assessing the truth. The Trump administration was a wholesale attack against our educational institutions, against the media, against our science. Every year he proposed cutbacks of 30% in our science budgets. So these were all important themes that I raised in my book, People, Power, and Profits. I also talked about the importance of inequality, and the book tried to explicate what were the sources of this inequality. I argued that inequality undermines the ability of societies to function well, and it even has an effect on economic performance, because much of the inequality in our society is related to exploitation. You know, there have been two views of inequality going back more than 200 years. One view was that inequality arises from what is called just deserts, the differences in the social contributions of different individuals. Some individuals contribute more and they get higher income, and some less. That's called the theory of marginal productivity, or neoliberalism. The other view was that inequality has a lot to do with exploitation, one group taking advantage of another through market power, exploitation of a whole variety of kinds. This view sees that a lot of inequality is associated with rent-seeking behavior, and that kind of behavior actually is associated with a weakening of the overall economic performance. So there are two different views. One is the people who are very wealthy have gotten wealthy by making the size of the national pie larger. And the other view is that those who have gotten very wealthy have gotten wealthy in part by exploiting others, through exploiting their vulnerabilities or exploiting market power. Now, obviously, there are elements of both of these. I don't want to say that it's one or the other, but I think in recent years, we've seen a lot of the latter, a lot of the exploitation. You look at the wealthiest people, and almost all of them, at least a significant part of their wealth comes from market power exploiting vulnerabilities. You have a president of the United States who's Trump University was gathering wealth by exploiting aspirations of other individuals to do better. And we see many of the wealthy people in the United States making their wealth out of gambling, out of the drug companies, the Sackler family making their money by exploiting the addictive drug, the opioids, causing an opioid crisis, the financiers making their wealth out of exploiting the poor, engaging in abusive credit card practices, predatory lending. So we've seen a very big doses of exploitation in every sphere of our economy. One of the implications of that analysis was that if we're going to get stronger economic growth and shared prosperity, they have to go together, and that we will need a new social contract. And that new social contract will has to have a better balance, a greater emphasis on the role of the state and civil society. A modern urban economy, a knowledge-based society, government is going to have to play a more important role, partly because knowledge is a public good, but it's also because we are so interdependent. There are externalities that are exerted. Externalities are pervasive, and we see that in climate change, and most importantly, right now, we're seeing it in the case of the pandemics. The pandemics are about an externality. Individuals' behavior can either help spread the disease or help control the disease. So these were the set of ideas that I tried to articulate in my earlier book. And as I've reflected on the pandemic, in many ways, it seems to have verified, reinforced the lessons that I articulated there. We have learned a lot from the crisis, and that learning itself will shape the post-pandemic world. As I said before, in particular, some countries have done better, both in controlling the disease and in controlling the aftermath. And by studying the successes and failures, there is much to learn about what makes for a good society and a good economy. Of course, there is still much that we do not know. There's still uncertainty about how long the pandemic will be with us. It's not just the vaccine, but its effectiveness. And prudence calls for not assuming that it will just disappear in the way that the President of the United States argued last February. But most importantly, even were it to disappear, it won't be the V-shaped recovery. It's too late for that. That might have been a fantasy back in February. We're in October, and the damage of this long economic downturn, likely to last for months later, has been done. So in the question period, I hope we can talk about my perspectives on what should be done. I'll say a little bit about that in this talk. But here I want to discuss what we've learned about the different economic systems and about inequality in particular, and its relationship to societal performance. Now, I need to say, it should be obvious, that when you have an event like this, there's going to be a wealth of studies for decades to come. You know, economists haven't agreed yet about the causes of the Great Depression. And so we're going to be debating about this pandemic like we continue to debate about the Great Recession and the Great Depression. The thesis I want to put forward is that societies and economies that have created the institutions, public and private, and structures that are good for long-term stable and sustainable growth are those that have done well in responding to the crisis and its economic aftermath. And I want to describe, or maybe just reiterate what I said already. The characteristics that have made for good performance in this pandemic are societies based on respect for science and expertise, That, as I say, was the foundation of the Enlightenment enterprise. They've also had good systems of social organization, a better balance between markets, state, and civil society. When a society has a crisis, this crisis or wildfires or economic downturn caused by financial crisis, they always turn to government. Government, collective action is what we need in responding to a threat to our entire society. But unfortunately, in the 40 years of neoliberalism, since Reagan and Thatcher, there's been a denigrating of the role of the state. And that meant in those societies that took that agenda seriously, there was not the competence, there wasn't the state competence to respond to the crisis in the way that it should. I'll say more about that later. There also has to be trust among citizens and respect for each other. This is important because the disease itself is a contagious disease, externalities, and behaviors that exemplify respect for others, respect for the externalities, understanding these externalities, are absolutely essential. And societies that have undermined that trust, undermined societal solidarity, have done very poorly. Almost inevitably, when societies are marked by high degrees of inequality, there won't be that kind of solidarity. There's going to be a divide. When the greater the economic and wealth divide, the greater the broader societal divide. And these are some of the adverse consequences of the extremes of inequality that you see, for instance, in the United States. One of the reasons why in a pandemic that kind of solidarity is especially important is because we don't have good tools, easy tools for controlling social behavior associated with externalities. You know, when we're talking about, say, air pollution, whether it's carbon dioxide or sulfur dioxide or nitrics, any form of pollution, we have, at least in principle, the ability to impose a pollution tax. And that kind of a pollution tax can discourage pollution. But we're talking here in the spread of this disease in kinds of interactions that occur daily, microscopically, in ways that we cannot use a tax system. And we have, therefore, the instruments we have are very blunt and very costly. The instruments we have are instruments like lockdowns. And so what we want to do is encourage social behavioral responses, social distancing, wearing masks, and in societies where there is social solidarity, cohesion, trust, respect for each other, they've been better able to engage in those kinds of behavioral responses which have contained the disease. On the other hand, in countries like the United States, where there are the extremes of individualism, without the understanding that one individual's freedom is another person's unfreedom, that one person's right to carry guns is another person's, undermines another person's right to live. So those countries have not surprisingly, not done well. And of course, leadership matters. Leaders that reflect those values of trust and social solidarity, those countries with leaders like that have done well. Leaders like in the United States and India that have exploited societal divisions to advance their own popularity, demagogues like Bolsonaro and Modi and Trump, they have led their countries in ways that, not surprisingly, the disease has spread. We are at a moment in history where the world has become bifurcated, with some countries reflecting these attributes, some reflecting the antithesis. The comparative economic systems used to focus on issues like centralization and decentralization. That was before the fall of the Iron Curtain. But still, comparative economic systems continues to discuss issues like the use of price versus regulatory mechanisms, the balance of governments and markets. And the latter has proved crucial in this crisis. But societies also differ in social cohesion, solidarity, trust, the role of science. And as I said earlier, a key role of the state is risk management. Michael Lewis wrote a very beautiful, popular book called The Fifth Risk. And he talked about the essential role of government in helping us manage risks. He talked all about the undermining of the ability of governments to manage that collective need of managing risk since the era of neoliberalism. It's interesting, he talked about a large number of risks that we weren't able to manage. He didn't talk about pandemics, but that's clearly the risk that we need. And in the United States, we see very clearly what has happened in the undermining of the ability to manage risk. As I said before, 40 years of denigrating the role of government has meant it's less capable of responding to this kind of risk. And just some examples, under Obama, there was created a White House office for the management of pandemics. It was put in the National Security Council because it was a matter of national security. Nothing could have done more damage to our economy than this nasty virus. But under this Trump administration, with the lack of understanding of the need for a balance, that White House office was disbanded. Markets don't handle, in general, the needs for managing risk well. That's why government has to have stockpiles of things like ventilators and masks and protective gear. But unfortunately, the current administration depleted those stockpiles, though to be fair, they were not fully stocked at the time they took office in 2017. But most importantly, we create institutions, scientific institutions, to help us manage, using expertise to manage a contagious disease. That was the Centers for Disease Control. It was one of the best institutions in the world for that. But under the Trump administration, that was defunded. So these are all examples of how ideology lead to economic systems not capable of responding to the risks that we face because they don't understand the need for the appropriate role of government. There are some other areas, though, where the appropriate role of government was not adequately recognized. There's a role for government in social protection, the provision of health, and macro management. And interestingly, the countries that were weak in the attributes of trust, science, social solidarity were weak in all of these. And the relevance of this is particularly been revealed by the pandemic. It was partly because the private sector itself is replete with all kinds of market failures. We know about that. We saw that in 2008, where markets were too short-sighted, financial markets engaged in excessive risk. But we see the same kind of failures in systems of corporate governance evident in the pandemic. The private sector was not resilient. It was not able to produce simple products like masks and protective gear, let alone complicated products like tests and ventilators. And again, it's the same kind of short-sightedness. Failures in corporate governance. We created cars without spare tires, saving a few pennies up front, but leaving a huge cost down the line when you got a flat tire. We created undiversified supply chains. So what we've seen is that the market is replete with failures, but the ideology that markets solve all problems meant that the government had been weakened, and so it couldn't compensate for these failures. Well, the importance of social protection, which I just mentioned a few minutes ago, is particularly relevant given that this is not an equal opportunity virus. And I want to spend a few minutes now talking about precisely that, the ways in which this virus has taken advantage of inequalities, but also increased those inequalities. It's very clear if you look at the data that this nasty virus goes after those who are in poor health conditions. And in countries without good, adequate public health, there are many individuals in that. The United States, again, I keep coming back to that because I think it's a good teaching example with a reminder of, a system that is not working. Life expectancy today in the United States is lower than it was 5 years ago before Trump got elected. But even more important is that there are huge health disparities, and that meant that there were a fertile field for the virus to take advantage of. And there's a high correlation between those with low income and those with low health. Ironically, many of the frontline workers who provide the goods and services that are absolutely essential for our society are precisely those who both get paid low income and have come down more with the disease because their health condition was poor and they've been more exposed. Unfortunately, the failure to manage the macroeconomy in ways that protect the most vulnerable has meant that these groups have been most ravished. And that means coming out of the crisis, these are the individuals who are likely to emerge most disadvantaged. So in the United States, we're talking a lot about the K-shaped recovery, that those at the top are going to come back doing very well, and those at the bottom are going to come out of this crisis very poorly. So let me just give you a few data points, data to show exactly how bad the differential effects have been. At the bottom, people are living about the bottom 50% paycheck to paycheck. And it's been 26 weeks since the beginning, and we only provide 26 weeks of of unemployment insurance. The United States has a very poor system of social protection. We don't have mandatory paid sick leave. And that means with people living paycheck to paycheck, when they get sick, they go to work. And that helps spread the disease itself. One of the reasons why the United States has been one of the worst performing countries in controlling the pandemic. Congress recognized this and passed a law saying that just for COVID-19, companies would have to provide paid sick leave. But then the richest companies in the world, the largest companies in the United States, lobbied successfully to be exempt. It was another act of selfishness, like the kind of thing we saw in the financial sector before 2008. They didn't care that their workers were dying, getting sick. It was short-sighted. It was foolish. It was cruel. But the result of that is that more than half of American workers today do not have paid sick leave. And so when they get sick, if they possibly go to work, they do go to work, and the disease spreads. At the same time, job losses are concentrated at the bottom. At the top, 2/3 of households bringing home more than $200,000 per year have not lost any employment income, while those down below have lost dramatically. So the impact on the people at the bottom has been dramatic. Just to give you a few other statistics, if you look at the people at the bottom, those who don't have only a high school education or less than a high school education, the unemployment rate for those in August was more than 12%. A quarter of these did not have health insurance, precisely in a time where health was being so important. In the last 2 weeks of August, 50% of these individuals reported that they were having difficulty paying their usual expenses. 25% were going to bed hungry, not because they were on a diet, because they couldn't afford food. And another 25% were having a difficulty meeting their rent payments. So at the bottom, the crisis has been devastating. And that means the likelihood is very strongly that when we emerge from the crisis, we will emerge with greater inequalities. We can't, of course, predict the future, how long, how deep the pandemic is going to be. But I want to, before turning to the broader issues of what should be done and how to respond to that from the macroeconomic point of view, I want to spend a moment talking about the macro models used to describe our economic system. The prevalent macroeconomic model is called the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model, which assumes the economy is always in some long-run equilibrium. It's clearly absurd. The idea that the economy is on a long-run trajectory in which all plans are fulfilled with rational individuals with rational expectations, where all shocks are exogenous and largely technological, is clearly absurd. The periods of most interest, most consequences, are periods where these conditions are not satisfied. Stock market crash that precipitated the Great Depression, the housing crash that precipitated the Great Recession, and now this pandemic. With Martin Guzman, I formulated a dynamic disequilibrium theory with noise, reflecting the importance of disequilibrium, of unpredictable circumstances, some of which are exogenous to the system, and emphasizing the decentralized adjustment processes which may be disequilibrating, and the importance of macroeconomic externalities. And we then use this model to study the pandemic. You might say only the President Trump believes in that equilibrium model, that there will be a V-shaped recovery back on a new trajectory. A belief in this everlasting Pollyannish equilibrium. What is particularly curious, a kind of cognitive dissonance, is that people would believe the economy is always in equilibrium just after they've just seen that the economy is not in that equilibrium. Unanticipated events like the Great Recession or unanticipated events like the pandemic should make one realize that the belief that one is always in a rational expectation in equilibrium with common knowledge and rational expectations just doesn't describe the world we live in. One aspect of the pandemic is that it engenders precautionary behavior. It emphasizes the limits of monetary policy and changing intertemporal prices, and the long-lasting hysteresis effects of insufficient fiscal policy, the long-lasting effects from bankruptcies and balance sheet effects. So let me, in the last few minutes, talk a little bit about what is to be done and what are the priorities that we need to focus on. First, of course, we have to address the issues of health. We have to protect the most vulnerable. We should be trying to keep workers attached to their job. We need a comprehensive solution, which in the context of the United States involves aid to state and local governments who have balanced budget frameworks and who, without that kind of assistance, massive layoffs already begun, largest source of increased unemployment currently in the recent weeks. We need massive assistance to our knowledge institutions, which are being devastated by this pandemic. To address the issues of the lack of insurance markets, we need to avoid excessive precautionary behavior that will lead to macroeconomic weaknesses. We have to make sure the money comes supporting the economy so long as it is needed. And we have to make sure that citizens know this to reduce their precautionary behavior. What is so interesting is that in many countries, including the United States, at the beginning, there was bipartisan support for high levels of support, high levels of fiscal spending, $3 trillion. We were constructing a bridge across to the post-pandemic world. But with that bridge halfway constructed, all of a sudden, one of the two parties says we should stop constructing, leaving people without the necessary support, and in effect, meaning that much of the money that previously spent will have been wasted. The money, of course, resources are scarce. That's the basic precept of economics. And money has to do double or maybe even triple duty. It has to help us build back better, to use Vice President Biden's, reflecting a vision of what kind of society will emerge post-pandemic. Well, I believe that the countries that turn to the expertise to fight the pandemic rather than ideology, they did better, and I think so too in the economic aftermath. Finally, I just want to say spend a few minutes about what this all implies for what is going on in Europe. It is a defining moment for Europe. It's a difficult moment in Europe. There was a lot of controversy, but Europe did respond in a way I think we have to recognize was impressive. It provided assistance, not enough, and too much in loans, but still it provided unprecedented levels of assistance. It didn't, in providing that assistance, impose counterproductive austerity as it had done in the 2010 euro crisis. And a breakthrough was the financing of this through Eurobonds, something that everybody urged in the Euro crisis, but they refused. Now they've done it. Again, a pillar has to be a commitment to financial mechanisms to help repay those loans. Digital taxation, a financial transaction tax, environmental tax, progressive taxation, a European-wide corporate tax. A whole range of taxes could provide the basis of greater European unity. And that's a pillar which I think Europe needs to do, and I'm hopeful that they will do going forward. So in conclusion, let me say, my belief is this has been an experiment, a painful experiment that has provided a lot of insights into alternative economic and social and political systems. My belief is that the countries that have done well in responding to the pandemic will be among those that will show the best performance in the coming years in every dimensions. These countries, of course, the countries that have done very poorly, like the United States, there is always the hope that they can change tack. History is not destiny, and the U.S. is at a crucial moment at which it may change the course. And so I want to leave on a note of optimism. While we've seen some very bad performance, economically, politically, socially, hopefully our citizens are learning, democracy will work, and this will be a defining moment, not just for the United States, but for the world, where having learned from the successes and failures, we can now attempt to construct societies with greater shared prosperity and in which science, expertise, and the lessons, the important lessons of social cooperation, social organization are taken seriously, and we can have a new era of shared prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. I much appreciate. Could you please turn your microphone off? Okay, thank you. Just your microphone. Yeah, thank you. I particularly appreciated your talk, and very stimulating one. I think we can have some very interesting discussion on what you have said. Let me introduce our two discussants first. They will have about 5 to 10 minutes each to say their comment, to propose their comments and stimulate further discussion. I think we'll have several points to make. I have myself some remarks, but I will wait the general discussion before. So I think we should leave Professor Anna Maria Simonazzi from University of Rome, give the floor to her and have her talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you also, Professor Stiglitz, for your broad picture on the direct consequences of COVID-19 on inequality. As you argued, the pandemic has increased inequality and divergence within and across countries in the developing as well as the developed world. And you said also that we learned a lot from the pandemic. Those countries that had the better institutions did better. And you said that solidarity and social cohesion is an important factor that was a factor of success and should be improved. I would like to take up your last point on the Eurozone and on European Union to see what has the Eurozone learned and what it has learned should last beyond the pandemic. This is an important question, I would say. So let me go through 2 or 3 issues that I think are important. The first one is that Europe is confronting the pandemic in a dramatically changing world order. The pandemic combined with 2 geopolitical shocks, the abrupt shift from rules to power in international relations, and the shift of the center from Europe to Asia. So a pandemic-induced world crisis and the consequent increase in populist nationalism can not only speed the decline of multilateralism, but may create severe disruption within the Eurozone. The dilemma of European countries can be summed like this. They are content to stay together to navigate the global disorder, but each plays for himself. So what I would like to ask is if we can expect that the institutions and the policies of the Eurozone that in the past increased divergence can learn from this pandemic and implement reforms that can be lasting and that can change the institutions and the policies of the European Union. So I would like to raise a few issues focusing on first Germany. Germany is the core of the Eurozone, as we know. So can German change? And this has to do with the question, what made for the abrupt U-turn in German stance towards European cooperation? Germany has always been against any kind of funding the debt and all that. So maybe that the increasing debt in southern countries has threatened the very existence of the currency union, which is what German exporters fear most. So maybe that there was a self-interest in the sustainability and the continuation of the Eurozone that did play a role in the U-turn in German attitude. However, the success of Alternative für Deutschland, a party to the far right that combines anti-Europe criticism with naked ethnocentric nationalism, might be another factor. To fight the enemy from within, German democracy needs Europe. And it needs growth. It needs growth both for internal cohesion and also to catch up with the digital competition. So the question concerning Germany is whether the Chancellor is seeking a sustained institutional solution or just one-off compensation for the economic havoc induced by the pandemic. So will the cooperative attitude of Germany last after the pandemic? The second question concerns the European Union and the changes that have been brought about by the pandemic. The European Commission has put together an impressive package, at least on paper. As you said, suspension of fiscal rules, a recovery fund, the SURE, the ESM, combined with the European Central Bank quantitative easing. So the question is this a new start? There are many hurdles ahead. The institutionalization of the coordination between fiscal and monetary policy is not at all ensured. There is a permanent deficit facility for macroeconomic stabilization to help weaker countries through deep crisis. Again, another question that is not at all granted. The need to finance these deficits with own resources, you mentioned several possibilities, or with joint perpetual bonds. But nonetheless, we are not very sure that the Stability Pact is actually defunct. So there is always this danger of stepping back from what we have achieved. And finally, the last point concerns the Southern European countries themselves, and in particular Italy, since I'm Italian. This calls into question not only the next generation EU, its size, its timing, but also the ability of the countries to respond, and of the Recovery Fund to respond to the structural problems of the European Union economies. In the short run, the package that has been put together by the European Commission is still a collection of EU-financed national measures. So not much the cohesion that you were trying to call for. So there is not a European Union response. Individual countries remain in charge of warding off the pandemic blow. And as you said, given their different ability to counter the crisis, counter-cyclical response is going to be smaller in those places that have been hit harder by the shock because of their lack of fiscal space. And moreover, the funds, the recovery funds and all the other funds, must be used to ease the structural change of the economies, to fill the gap in the development between the southern countries and the north, the core countries. And here again, the lack of coordination between the various levels of governance is equally troubling, together with, the different capacity of the different countries to put in work these structural funds. So this refers to industrial policy, which I believe what Mario will talk about. But in the end, to conclude, you said, and I think you are right, we learned a lot, and macroeconomics eventually has changed since the 2008 crisis. I think that the question is whether it will be able to shape economic policy towards a more equal and more sustainable union. That is, to impose that cohesion, that social solidarity, let's say, between nations that we need within the European Union. And I think that for this to succeed, we must be able to reconcile divergent interests that are within and between countries. And this is the most difficult, I think, it will be the most difficult task. But I will wait for a discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna Maria. Thank you for your comments. I think we can take Professor Pianta's comments first, and then collect other questions from the floor. Let me just remind that we are going to have room for questions from people who are attending the conference from Teams, and also those who are attending from the streaming from YouTube and so on are also unable to write their own questions, and we will read some of them to Professor Stiglitz. I know that now we are followed by about 250 persons over streaming, so this is an interesting event, and many people are actually raising questions in this moment. So feel free to write your own question or raise hands when it is when it is possible. So, Mario, why don't you make
Thank you very much. Thank you, Antonello. It's a pleasure to hear your talk, Professor Stiglitz. You may remind that 8 years ago you were in Urbino discussing the political economy of globalization. It was a very nice event at the time. I will be short and focus on 3 questions. One of the effects of the pandemic on the economy may be an increasing divide within the economic structures, for instance, between the financial economy and the real economy. And the stock market has behaved in a very unpredictable and sort of crazy way. So how do you explain Wall Street behavior and response to the crisis as opposed to the crisis that has hit the real economy? And in particular, the divide within the stock market between the booming digital companies' stock prices, such as Amazon, and the crisis of others. The second question it focuses on the real economy and the structural change that has been produced by the crisis and will be an important character of the way we reconstruct the economy. Can we go back to fully fledged industrial policies with an active role of the state investing, including launching state-owned enterprises in some cases? In Europe, the suspension of state aid rules preventing the action support of the state to firms has meant that first of all, in Germany, there has been a massive influx of public money in the capital of firms in order to keep key strategic firms alive in spite of the falling demand and to preserve industrial capabilities. So what could be the guidelines for rebuilding productive capabilities and also in selecting the good as opposed to the bad economic activities that we want to have in our future? And the third question is on the distribution outcomes. You emphasized a lot the unequal effects of the pandemic in terms of economic losses, but can we change in a structural way, in some ways, the mechanism of distribution, the way wages are set, the way lack of welfare protection is still prevalent in many countries, limiting the amount of profits and the amount of top manager pay, or what could be the structural tools that make sure that we go out of this crisis with an economy which is going to be less unequal than we've experienced in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. I think we can leave room for a few questions and interventions from the floor, and then leave the word to Professor Stiglitz again. Any interventions and questions from the floor? Okay, Marcello Signorelli, Pompeo della Posta, and so on. So we are having several interventions. Okay, Marcello Signorelli, you asked first the word. Okay, you can go. Marcello Signorelli is around. Then it's probably that's probably a problem with giving the word.
Now I think it's okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Stiglitz, for your very interesting lecture. I would like if you had something about China, not only about the reaction of China to pandemic, but also to the, in some sense, paradoxical advantage, comparative advantage that China will have, not only now, but probably also in the next year, not only comparing US, but also Europe. So I would like to ask you something about this first powerful economic and very influential country in the next decades. So thank you very much.
Okay, Pompeo della Posta.
Yeah, with pleasure. Thank you. I'm afraid my video doesn't work. I don't know why, but I hope my voice can get to you. So thank you so much for your inspiring presentation, Professor Stiglitz. I just very quickly want to ask you about you mentioned at some point the fact that in Europe maybe too much debt. If I remember correctly, you said too much debt, namely too many loans, too many loans to countries, right? So rather than maybe funds, given through the recovery fund to be shared by the whole community. So my question is about money, monetary policy. What would you think might have been the role of money? Namely, what about monetizing this debt? Namely, why getting more debt rather than printing money and paying right away the expenses that we have to make? There is no risk of inflation, no risk of losing credibility. This money that would be printed would just go for a good cause, for the cause of responding to this totally unexpected and huge shock. Mm-hmm. So would that be a possibility, or would there be a role for monetary policy together with fiscal policy, together with the Euro bonds? Of course, this is good news for Europe, good news for us. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Pompeo. We have Elena Vallino here.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much for your nice lecture. One question comes to my mind. So we have seen that this pandemic was actually was defined as a syndemic. So it means the coexistence of different pieces of disease together with the interaction with the complex systems. And this worsened the final result of the pandemic. And this issue is strictly linked to the huge problem of big data analysis. So since all here we are economists, which is your opinion about the role of economists, also from both empirical but also from a theoretical point of view, first in the big data analysis, and secondly in the interaction with other disciplines, because interdisciplinarity is something that is raised by everybody in this time, but in practice it is always more difficult to implement it in the universities, but also in the policies. So how could a good economist interact with other disciplines and with the big problem of analyzing big data? Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. We have another question from Hope Gola. Can you talk?
Okay, I don't know if you can hear me, but good afternoon, everybody. And I want to say thank you for a wonderful lecture. I'm Hope Gola from Africa, so my question is tilted towards Africa. During the presentation, you mentioned something about the countries that were more into solidarity and self-respect could easily or were easily able to implement some of those laws like wearing face masks, social distancing, and all. Now, where can you place Africa in such a situation? Because we value our cultural rights most of the time, but yet in terms of implementing the laws like wearing the face mask and social distancing, from all we could get from the news and the people around us, they were never implemented. So where does Africa stand in terms of COVID-19 and relating it to inequality? Thank you.
Thank you, Hope. I also have a question to add, while maybe some other people might want to write or ask another question. The issue I would like to raise to Professor Stiglitz is concerns indeed the fact that he said that we have learned a lot from this crisis, probably as it comes on top of another big crisis. So there's learning from many different disasters. One thing that you suggested in a recent contribution to CNN was that actually some countries might have learned from a very inadequate way of dealing with global supply chains. You said explicitly that many countries happened to learn that they had built global supply chains that were very insufficiently resilient. So can I ask you to be more precise on what your thought is about this point? Thank you. If there are no other questions for the moment, we could ask Professor Stiglitz to give his replies to the comments that we had so far.
Thank you. It's a rich set of questions, and I probably won't have in the limited amount of time to answer all of them. Maybe I should begin first by addressing a very broad framework question that was went through several of the questionings that was asked. And that is, as we think about what lessons that we've learned, if we think about what are the forces at play shaping policy, there are several forces going on. One of them is knowledge, the kind of knowledge that we're learning from this experience. But another important force is ideology. And one of the things that I was trying to argue is that this pandemic was a confrontation between the neoliberal ideology that said markets can handle everything and reality, and what we can learn from experience. So I don't think you should ever underestimate the importance of ideology. It's played a very important role in shaping the Maastricht Treaty, a lot of the rules, the Growth and Stability Pact were all shaped by a kind of ideology. And one of the bases of my hopes going forward is that this confrontation between a lot of the neoliberal ideology and reality will undermine that kind of ideology and enable Europe to better attack some of the key issues. But there's a third element that was raised in some of the questions, and that is that interest and identity. Some of what is going on reflects conflicts of interest, the difference between the interest of the creditors and debtors that played an important role in at least some interpretations of what happened in the Euro crisis. But one of the things that many people have noted about what has happened in the last 10 years is that many of the supporters of demagogues like Trump or the AfD, Marine Le Pen, the policies being advocated by these people do not actually serve the interest of those groups. The result of the Republican policies in the United States is that more people will have less health insurance, a tax cut that went to the billionaires and the corporations. Actually, when the fully implemented, result in an increase in taxes on a majority of people in the middle. Their interests were not served. But what was going on was what is sometimes called identity politics. The fact is that the establishment had not served them well. They had promised that globalization, financialization would, through a process of trickle-down economics, benefit everybody, and it clearly didn't. And so these movements became anti-establishment movements, identity politics that had very little to do with their own interests. And that brings me to in a sense, one of the main themes of this talk. One of the reasons why we've had to pay such a high price for inequality is that this inequality has provided a fertile field for demagogues, which has shaped some of the politics that we've been confronting, and that I've emphasized the importance of solidarity, dealing with inequality in responding to the pandemic, but also the implications for ability for our politics to work in ways that serve our broader society is absolutely essential. So one of the questions that was asked had to do with multidisciplinary approaches. One of the things I think that's been very insightful in the United States is our understanding, and I've seen some work in France that are very similar, is understanding some of the alienation, the anti-establishment feeling, the yellow vest in France, related to coming out of the work of sociologists, deep analyses of why some parts of our society have been left behind, why they've become that there are these social disparities that have opened up, as well as economic disparities, and how do we understand the lack of mobility, why some groups can move, others seem to be stuck in places that are not doing very well. So I think that is going to be absolutely essential as we go forward in trying to understand the evolution of our economy and our societies. Now, there are a couple of very interesting questions about where is Europe going to be going? Are these changes permanent? Let me just express a certain hopefulness, but a recognition of the fragility, and then raise one question that has been a great concern to me. I was on a Zoom with the German Minister of Finance, and it was very clear that he reflected this very marked change in Germany's position from where it was in the Euro crisis. He was from the Social Democratic Party, SPD, and a question in my own mind was that reflecting the movement from an old Minister of Finance that was more wedded to an outmoded set of ideas about austerity, to a more 21st century understanding of economics, and a real concern about the broader social economic consequences of policies, understanding the dangers of austerity. So But I think the question raised is it was just a change in the politics in Germany, or were there these underlying drivers that mean that this is likely to be a longer-term change in policy? I hope that it's a longer and deeper change, because Germany is realizing the need for cooperation. That's an issue I'm going to come to in just a second. One of the aspects of this change, though, is a recognition that the old Growth and Stability Pact, the 3% deficit to GDP target, it was never based on any economic analysis. And many in Italy have been trying to, a slight modification, talking about moving to the green rule, exempting, as well as the golden rule, exempting investment, and particularly exempting green investment. I think Europe's realization that it has to work together to make sure that there's a green transition has been very useful in focusing on the need for investment and realizing that the 3% arbitrary deficit to GDP ratio is a major impediment to achieving that green transition. So I'm hopeful that the pandemic, as well as this realization of where it is absolutely essential for Europe and the world to go, will mean that these changes are permanent. There were two other policy instruments that I want to, that were raised in various questions that I want to speak to. One is, I think perpetuities are a better way of engaging in the requisite finance, the financial cost of the ability to support much larger spending with perpetuities is pretty obvious. So I'm a great supporter of the idea of using these perpetuities as instruments. There was a question about the use of just issuing money. After all, there's no inflation. Issuing money is like a perpetuity, but just has zero interest rate. And in a world in which there is no inflationary pressure, doesn't it make more sense to issue money, what you might call money rain? It would help stimulate the economy. There are obviously limits to it. At some point, the economy does return to full employment, and inflationary pressures might start to grow. And at that point, one has to switch to other forms of finance. I think that's right. We don't know exactly how much excess capacity there is. We didn't know that before the pandemic, and we know it even less after the pandemic. But I think the first instrument should be the issuance of money, and then the second instrument, the issuance of perpetuities. And these will provide much more fiscal space. The other issue concerning Europe that I want to mention, and has not been brought up, is the importance of what has sometimes been called the rule of law. Europe is more than, at least in my mind, just a trade agreement. It's not just a common market. It is a collection of countries that stand for certain values. And I think it is absolutely essential for Europe to stand by those values, which means to stand up against Orban in Hungary and other countries that engage in actions which are undermining democracy, squashing free media, impacting adversely on on education. There were a whole set of questions on education, on multilateralism. Let me just very briefly say the following. I think the pandemic has highlighted the need for cooperation, but at the same time has helped illustrate the way globalization had been managed before had some deficiency, in particular a creation of global supply chains that were not resilient. But the main lesson I hope that will come out of this is the need for more global cooperation. Global cooperation in the area of health, climate change, a whole host of areas. But at the same time, what we are seeing is the world is moving in a way in which some countries are moving with less commitment to democracy and human rights than we would like. Let me put it another way. One of the questions directed attention to the fact that China, with its surveillance, with its authoritarian regime, may be better able to control the pandemic. And the surveillance technologies that enable that to be done also may reinforce that kind of authoritarianism. I think Europe and America need to stand for the principles of human rights and democracy. But the fact that we're, in the aftermath of the collapse of the Iron Curtain, there was that Pollyannish hope that we would all converge to liberal democracies and free market economies, what Francis Fukuyama talked about as the end of history. That was a foolish fantasy. But what we now know is we have to cooperate with countries that we may not fully share values with. We have to cooperate on issues of pandemics. We have to cooperate on climate change. So, to me, the pandemic has emphasized the need for cooperation, but what has been happening in the world, particularly in the last 5-10 years, means that it won't be based on the same kinds of view about globalization. It'll be a different kind of globalization where we focus on cooperating in the areas where we have to cooperate, but at the same time articulate very strongly and practice our views, our values about multilateralism, about democracy and human rights. I'm afraid that the time is up, and I think I have another seminar.
Okay, thank you. Actually, yeah, we would have liked to have much more time with you, but unfortunately it's not possible. We had also a couple of more questions, but I think you've been even too generous with us, so we thank you very much. And I have to bring you the salutations from the rector, who had to leave away, but he much appreciated your intervention, and thanks for really stimulating a very, very lively debate. And we hope to have you again in Urbino. We remember very well when you came for the celebration of this 500 years of the University of Urbino in 2006. That was quite an event for us, and we would definitely like to have you back again. Thank you very much, really, indeed, and have a nice life. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. And points, probably we should have had much more time, but actually this is how it works. And so unless there's somebody from the floor who wants to say something specific, I would say that we can close now with both the streaming and the session. Okay, so thanks to everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow for the continuation of this conference at 9 o'clock. The first parallel sessions will start at that time, 9 o'clock, of course, European time. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.